All right, Jeff. Good to have you on the podcast, and really looking forward to learning about your work and learning from you today. So, why don't you tell us about yourself and what you've been up to these days?
Sure. So a little background about myself. I started off my career as a developer, worked through a couple different companies, some death mark projects doing waterfall, and this Agile thing came about, and I was one of the biggest naysayers out there about Agile. And then, I went to this conference and I saw Bob Gallen speak, and it started to click for me, and I was like, okay, I get what Bob's saying, but this is not what I'm hearing over here from these books or these other articles that I was reading. And so I kind of dug into what Bob was saying and some different parts of the community and learned a lot more and embraced a lot of different things. Fast forward a couple of years, I joined this consulting company, and it was a company that, had a strong foundation from Ken Schwaber, and worked with him closely on how they use Scrum back in, I don't know, it was like right after Scrum.org got, formed around 2010. And so we were working on these turnkey solutions where you'd kind of buy a whole entire development team, whole Scrum team, really, product owner, Scrum Master, the full stack development team, and they would develop a product for you. And did that for a while, and then got into Agile coaching. And about a year ago now, I started my own company doing Agile coaching and training. And so I'm a Scrum.org coach or trainer. So I'm a professional Scrum trainer with Scrum.org. So I do training. I train a lot of different classes from Scrum Master, product owner, team courses focused around UX and Kanban, scaling, all different types of things. And so I just, teach a variety of courses and work with a lot of different people and organizations. But I really enjoy spending time doing both the coaching and the training. So I spend a lot of time doing both, not just the training, because I like to, practice what I preach and talk about, and I like
Yeah.
to apply and try a bunch of different experiments out and learn from those things.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks for sharing. In your LinkedIn, you say that your mission is to end human suffering at work. I really liked it and appreciated it. So tell us more about that, how that reflects in your work that you do on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, I think that I have a deep care for people. And once you've worked for purpose, some bigger purpose, and you've been on a really high functioning team doing that, where you've, had autonomy, you were able to master your craft, there's really no way you ever want to go back to something different. You never want to just be that cog in a machine. And so I hope to kind of unleash, people within organizations and help them to really be the best versions of themselves and work for, whatever purpose, is meaningful for them in their lives.
Yeah, no, that's great. So in our topic, we wanted to talk about scaling Agile, scaling Scrum, scaling teams. So yeah, let's just jump into it. How would you talk to a company that wants to scale Agile? How would you engage with them, or how would you train or coach them on scaling Scrum or Agile?
Yeah, I think the first question is, how do you know you need that many people right now? How do you know you don't need, 10 people, 9 people? How do you know you need to scale?
Yeah.
So I guess I would ask, what problem are you trying to solve?
Mm-hmm.
Why do you think, or, what is your goal? What are we optimizing for?
Mm-hmm.
And once we know those things, it's like, well, how many people are actually doing the work?
Mm-hmm.
And what advantages do we have by adding multiple teams? Because every time you add more teams, you lose a
Mm-hmm.
little bit from that first team. So if we got one team that can solve a problem and we add another team, that first team just lost a bunch of efficiency. They lost a bunch of effectiveness. They're going to produce less because they have to coordinate with that other team.
Yeah.
Now you add a third team. Now the first and the second team lose a little bit, and the third team comes in and they're not going to, they got to catch up. And so every time you're adding a team, you're losing something. And so you need to be able to measure how much value is being added by each team and kind of know when to stop scaling and adding more teams.
Mm-hmm.
The problem, though, that I see with most organizations is that when they decide to scale,
Mm-hmm.
they tend to add like a product owner over each
Mm-hmm.
team. And then they
Yeah.
say, well, they need to coordinate and sync, and there's dependencies between them.
Yeah.
And so then they put another product owner, an Uber product owner, over the top of that product owner. Maybe they call it a product manager or
Yeah.
something like that. And then they'll add another one on top of that. And then they're like, we have technology concerns and we need tech leads at each of those levels. And
Yeah.
we need to have, someone that can help manage the dependencies. We'll call
Yeah.
them a Scrum Master, an Agile coach that, they'll rename these things that they aren't are. I actually walked into one organization one time and they had just as many people that were up there on that product owner, transformation, tech lead, Scrum Master level, people
Yeah.
not doing the work to the people that were actually developing doing the work. So, I mean, if you scale 50 people and you have 25 that are telling you how to work and 25 people doing the work, that doesn't work very well, right? Like, there's not a lot of autonomy. There's a lot of churn, a lot of work that's getting created. And so people create a lot of work when that ends up happening. So I call that scaling demand. So the demand is the demand of work, more work's being generated, instead of scaling delivery, the people that actually deliver the work. So when we scale, if we are going to scale, we want to scale to problem solving teams that can solve any problem that's off of your product backlog.
Yeah.
Then that's not typical. Another common pattern is a lot of organizations will create teams that are aligned around subsystems. So maybe it's an application, or maybe it's like we have a database team, we got a back end team, we got a front end team, we got a QA team, maybe not even a QA team anymore, a UX team or a Salesforce team or something else, down the road.
Yeah.
And then there's handoffs between each of those teams, and each of those teams have a backlog. Well, that's a lot of dependency management. How do you know what the most important thing is?
Right.
So those aren't really great patterns either for scaling, because you're just adding a lot of churn into the system and delay when you scale like that.
Yeah, no, that example is so real. I've actually been in a situation where I was a Scrum Master. This was a few years ago, and we had an Agile coach come in, and she was helping out with some Agile Scrum stuff, doing some assessment, things like that. And we have a product owner, and we have a technical product owner, and we had 2 developers, and there were so many people actually managing the work, and people who are doing the work were just like 2 people. And that's really interesting that you brought that example.
Yeah. And that so brings up another thing. Like when you talk about a product owner, when Ken and Jeff created Scrum and they had this rule called the product owner, they had a very specific purpose for a product owner. They own the product, right? So how many people can actually own a product? It's one owner. It's like a CEO. So if you're a company of 5 people, you have one CEO. If you're a company of 5,000 people, you have one CEO. Same thing when you're scaling Scrum or scaling any Agile environment. You want one central decision maker. Otherwise, what's I've seen happen is people don't talk to each other, or they have different opinions. These people, these different roles of product ownership, right? And so then all of a sudden the development team is like, hey, I developed something over here. Person A loves it, person B doesn't. So now we're refactoring because those 2 weren't talking. And so now we're spending multiple time reading that. Oh, now person C doesn't like it. So now we got to refactor. And we just keep churning on the same thing. So then they say, hey, we need to sign off. The 3 of you need to get together and say we agree on something before we do it. Well, then they do, and they write it in a certain way, but then it's not exactly what any of them were thinking, and none of them are happy. And so it just leads down this path of because no one person owns it, nobody really owns it, right? There's no ownership, and the decision making slow, and the vision isn't aligned, and there's no one accountable for validating those decisions in the market. And so it just leads to, I guess, poor product ownership when you try to have multiple people doing it.
Yeah, no, that's so true. So Jeff, so our audience is, somebody who's really curious to learn, okay, how does Scrum scale in a company, right? And this is about, okay, there's a company like CUNA Mutual or FSM, which is in Wisconsin, right? So there are already 5,000 people, and then company decides to go Agile, and they actually start out with Scrum. So in that context, like, how would you help somebody new understand, what are those scaling Scrum practices?
Yeah, so I think there's some main rules of thumb when we're going to start to scale Scrum. And so if you remember these relationships, it'll help you. When you have when you have one product, you have one product owner. You have one product backlog.
Got you.
You have one to many teams. You have one definition of done, and you have one done increment, one done product at the end. So then the next question that people often ask is, okay, so what is a product? And that's where most people go wrong, is they define their product very narrow, and maybe not even wrong. They just are optimizing for something maybe that they don't know they're optimizing for. So if you have a very narrow product definition, just say your product is something, it's just this one little application or one little thing inside of it. You're gonna, at some point, The
Yeah.
companies need to allocate dollars to say, how much are we investing in this thing?
Right.
And then when something like COVID happens and you say, oh
Yeah.
my gosh, this plan we made for the whole year needs to get thrown out the window, it makes
Right.
it very difficult to move that money around, move the teams around to say, now we need to work on this, now we need to work on that. And it
Right.
doesn't have to be COVID. It can be, there was a company I worked with and there was a major vendor that they had. And basically once they came to them, I don't know, maybe it was March or something like that. And
Mm-hmm.
right after, they did all their yearly planning that they normally did. And
Mm-hmm.
they said, oh, we're not going to be able to accept payments for you. And this is a, Fortune 500 company. And
Mm-hmm.
they're like, so this whole process isn't going to work. Well, there's going to be no cash flow coming in November if we don't get this thing fixed. Well,
Mm-hmm.
and the way they used to work, it might have taken 3 to 6 months to even put a team around that because you'd have had to like fight to find some people that actually could work on this problem. Well, if
Yeah.
you just have problem-solving teams, you just say, hey, this is now the number one thing in the backlog.
Yeah.
Teams A, B, and C, you're working on it because you're the teams that are available and
Mm-hmm.
start tackling this thing and figure it out. And so that
Yeah.
gives you a lot more flexibility as an organization to respond to change.
Right.
And so that product definition is always a tricky thing. But I
Mm-hmm.
always look at a couple factors, and I look at the code bases. So where's our dependencies between the code when we're developing, if this is a software product? I look
Mm-hmm.
at who are the people that are actually doing the work. If we
Mm-hmm.
think that we call them projects or products, but they're projects, and they're
Mm-hmm.
really the same people, but we're splitting them across 5 different things and wanting to work on all the same time. And
Yeah.
say, hey, I need your help working on this thing. And you're like, no, that's my Tuesday thing. It's Wednesday. You have to wait till Tuesday to come back and work on me
Yeah.
with me. Like that delays everything a week, right? Like those types of things happen. So why don't we
Yeah.
just stack and rack all those things into one list and just say,
Mm-hmm.
this is our broader product and here's how we deliver business outcomes. I always think of it as a product. I also look at customers. Who do you actually buys your product or
Mm-hmm.
who uses your product? And you should align around those types of people as well. And think about
Right.
what people outside of your organization would call your product.
Mm.
So think about it outside in, not inside out. When you're in an organization, a lot of times
Yeah.
something feels like a product, but it's really not a product to anyone outside. You should almost
Right.
be able to put a P&L around any project you have.
Yeah.
Oh, it's never profit and loss center is what you should be able to put
Mm-hmm.
around it, right?
Yeah. Definitely. No, that's great. That's great. So I've actually had people ask me about the working from one product, a backlog, multiple, maybe two product owner or two or three teams working from a single product backlog. So what are some team agreements that you need to set or you need to coach teams to set so that you have that process smooth or have no confusion on that single product backlog?
Right. So if you've got one product backlog, you should have one product owner. Now,
Okay.
as you have multiple teams, there is a
Mm-hmm.
capacity that a product owner can only handle, right? Like at a certain
Mm-hmm.
point, man, you get the 10, 12 teams, like there's no way one person can keep up with that. So then maybe you
Yeah.
need to split, right? That into a smaller product. And then you
Mm-hmm.
can have these product areas maybe inside of there, but you're bound by the capacity of the product owner really at that point
Yeah.
and what they can handle. But let's just say you have 5 teams and you got
Yeah.
one product owner and one product backlog.
Mm-hmm.
Well, in that case, the product owner needs to elevate themselves, right? If you're
Right.
Jeff Bezos, you're the CEO of Amazon. You're
Yeah.
not gonna occupy yourself with packaging Amazon boxes, right? You're not gonna
Yeah.
get down into the details. You're gonna say, how do I
Right.
set up an environment for people to be successful? And how do I make
Mm-hmm.
sure we're working on the most important things? How do I make sure I'm promoting innovation and creativity and all the
Mm-hmm.
things that I want to promote? And that's what you have to do as a product owner at that level.
Yeah.
So maybe at that level, you're like, I'm going to take more on a product management type role. I'm going to take on more of a leader type role, like a leader in an organization. And
Mm-hmm.
things that maybe some product owners would do if they just had one team, like something that's maybe more analyst driven, more typically BA type of work,
Yeah.
or more typical like PM type work in the traditional sense. Maybe that work gets delegated to the team and you have people on the team that do that for you. They're
Right.
not product owners. You just need these skill sets on this team to handle
Right.
that. So the product owner can now elevate, because just like if you were in a startup, that
Yeah.
owner might do some stuff that's, they might do their own accounting. They might do their own payroll. But eventually they're
Right.
going to say, hey, we have so many people. I can't be doing payroll every week. I need to go
Right.
work on something else in this strategic, partnership or whatever with this organization. And that's a better time served, better way for me to serve my time. Same thing with a product owner.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, I've my experience of working with product owners in agile teams where they're product owners for multiple teams. They're stretched thin, and it's a huge responsibility to become one person to prioritize and give people direction in terms of where product will go, especially if there's no product management in the organization. So it's a tough job, but I'm pretty sure that's the class that you teach
Yeah,
on
yeah,
how to
yeah.
do better product ownership.
It is. It is a really tough role. I mean, I don't know. All roles are tough, but it's
Yeah,
probably the toughest role because there's a lot of responsibility and you're kind of out on an island as this product
mhm,
owner, right? Like no one really truly understands everything you're going through as a product owner because you are the only product owner in this case. And
right.
it's this one product and no one has that full context. But, you can go talk to other product owners, scrum masters, people like that to help you, as you go through that journey in product
Yeah.
ownership.
One other thing I've just seen generally around the Midwest area is, like my experience of working with product owner, I end up becoming friends with them. And they're, after I found out their background, they were just project managers and they actually never went through any real training or, there was not really training provided for them. They just went through maybe a day or two of training and they got thrown into the product owner role, which is one of the most important role. So in those cases, like what's your suggestion if there's a Scrum Master or teams working with in that scenario?
Yeah, I think if I'm in that scenario, I want to make sure that I have the
Mm-hmm,
autonomy to
mm-hmm,
make calls on decisions, right? And they're respected in
mm-hmm,
my organization. I
mm-hmm,
want to make sure that I have visibility and maybe
mm-hmm,
ownership into financials, P&L. I
mm-hmm,
want to see the P&L. I would like to have ownership into that. And I want to
mm-hmm,
just make sure that as long as I have the responsibility and accountability that a product owner should have, and there's
mm-hmm.
much more we could get into,
Yeah,
then I'm okay. Then I'm in a good spot. Now it's like now you need to continuously improve. You're
yeah,
gonna make mistakes. No one's gonna be 100%, make 100% bets on all the experiments and hypothesis they have, and they're gonna be right. There's a reason
right.
they're hypothesis, they're guess. So you need to be able to learn quickly with small experiments that are cheap and validate things in the marketplace.
Mm-hmm,
So if I had to boil down the three things, we talk about this a lot in the
mm-hmm,
Scrum.org community for a product owner. You have three main
mm-hmm,
things, the three V's of product ownership. Set the vision, make sure you're getting value that's being delivered by the development team, you're
mm-hmm,
maximizing value that's being delivered, and then
mm-hmm.
validate that you're getting that value. And you don't
Right,
validate that value until you actually deliver it to a marketplace and you measure with the value that's actually coming back.
right.
So I like to think really when I'm a product owner, I don't want to get down into the weeds. I want to be here's the objectives, here's how we could solve it. Here's some ideas. Team, let's talk about how do we actually solve this and get this to this objective and
Yeah.
prioritize at that higher level.
Yeah, definitely. Just because we have some of the audience who come from the agile business analysis community, I want to ask one question. Like, how do you see the role of the business analyst supporting product ownership or role of a BA in an agile role? How do you see that working?
They're just I would put BA that
Mm-hmm,
I want that skill set, that analysis skill set,
mm-hmm,
the ability to ask the great questions, to
mm-hmm,
empathize with customers and users, to really
mm-hmm,
understand the problem and the goals that we're after.
mm-hmm.
I want those skills on my team, and so I really just I want to put them on the development team. I want to
Yeah,
empower them to help serve that team to elevate. But you know what? I also want business analysts that there might not be enough work just to do that, and I don't want to
right,
redefine everything. So at
right.
times maybe you need a test. At times
Yeah,
maybe to help create some screens and create some mock-ups. Like there's really
right,
great tools out there that you don't have to code to be able to use.
right.
There's lots of things you can do. Maybe it's the validation, right? Going out in the community and saying, hey, let's do some
Right.
user testing. Those
Yeah.
would be all things that I'd say, hey, these are things to think about. There's this company out there called Menlo Innovations, and
I know.
they're one of the companies that's touted, I think, as one of the more agile companies out there. Rich Sheridan has this book, Joy Inc., that kind of talks about their culture. And they had this role called the high-end anthropologist. And so what
Nice.
a high-end anthropologist is basically BA, UX, QA all rolled into one, but it's
Mm-hmm.
it's much more about like how do people work and how can we optimize to solve things for people. So they'll actually go to a site for wherever the product's going to be used. Like if we're
Right.
building something for mechanics, they're going to actually go to the garage and watch them work and be like, oh, this can't be an iPad app like we thought. Like everyone's wearing gloves when they work. Like that ain't going to work,
Right.
Like they
Right.
can't use touch screens. We need to make it, something on a console with a computer, and we need to have maybe one of those rugged ones, whatever it might be.
Yeah.
So that's the role I could see the BAs playing. I think they need to expand
Sure.
their skills. I think
Yeah.
another path though is more data driven. So I think that the future is going to be a lot more business intelligence, and so a lot more analytics collected in your applications about usage, patterns, demographics. And if you can slice and dice that data, that can inform the product owner to help make better decisions on what the most important thing is to build next. And so I can
Yeah.
see BAs also diving deep into that because they need business knowledge, plus they also need to understand the data, which they generally do. So
Yeah.
I think
No,
those are
that's
two
great.
good areas.
Yeah, and then you brought up UI UX, and then you said you offer a training around UI UX too. So how do you
Yeah,
see that working in the Scrum or Agile teams?
yeah. So, it's not all that different than
Hmm.
QA was about 5 to 10 years ago. We used to have development teams and QA teams, and now
Right.
everybody has accepted that it's just there's no reason you would put those on separate teams. You would always put
Right.
that together into one team. UX is the same way. I think that 5, 10 years from now, we'll be saying, oh yeah, of course UX belongs on your Scrum team. Like that's just part of your
Yeah.
cross-functional team. You definitely
Right.
need those skill sets. And so that's the way I see it. Some people then question, well, how do you actually do that? Like there's some UX things, like if you're going to do like a diary where people record journal entries over months, how they use a product or something like that.
Right.
How would you do that in a sprint? Your sprint's only 2 weeks. And it's like, well, that's refinement. And you just need to, plan that ahead of time
Hmm.
or whatever work it's influencing and know that that work needs to be done so that you can actually do the development work on that thing. And there might be
Yeah.
cases where you can actually do the UX work like beforehand or during a sprint, or you don't not
Yeah.
beforehand, but just do it during. There was a team I was a part of, and we were building a product for a large retail organization, something
Hmm.
probably everybody knows.
Hmm.
And when we were building this application for them, we did 2 week sprints, and we'd go to day 8 of every sprint,
Hmm.
and we would go to a store and we'd say, hey, here's some new functionality we added over the last 8 days. Here's a
Yeah.
use case. Can you walk through this? And we would record their screen so the rest of the team
Hmm.
could see it. And we'd send 2 people. Usually it was the UX person and one other person from the development team. And the other person would usually record, the UX person would facilitate.
Yeah.
And that's how we started. But then we traded roles. And then before long, it didn't have to be the UX person. And so day
Right.
8 of every sprint, we're showing stuff that wasn't done, wasn't fully tested, but it was pretty close. And we were getting direct feedback on it. And then we would go to these executive stakeholders in a sprint review. And
Yeah.
they'd be like, oh, you totally got to move this button here or these fields here from this screen.
Yeah.
It's like, no, actually, we just talked with the users. Here's, the recording if you want to look at it. But this is how they're
Yeah.
actually using it. And this is what their workflow is. So here's why we're doing it. And they'd be like,
Yeah.
oh, I didn't know that. And so we built it, for the user. So then the adoption, the creation afterwards of people accepting this application was just really high because they helped build it, right? It was every sprint, maybe even multiple times a sprint, they were giving us feedback and we were applying it right from users, not just from an executive team. So I'd see UX being fully integrated into a Scrum team, and it's
Yeah.
just something you're doing all the time.
Yeah, no, no, that's great. That's good to hear because, once you have those practices up front, I think it really helps teams to understand who their end users are and how they're going to be delighting them. And also set out those experiments to like test when they build a product, what is the output or what is the outcome of the product that they built. So,
Right.
no, that's great to hear. So what else? What else do we need to know about scaling Scrum or?
Sure. Yeah. So I think we covered quite a bit, and I would say that there's not one right answer. There's not
Mhm.
one framework that's like this is the absolute best. The framework's not going to do it all for you.
Mhm.
There's a lot of hype, right now around the Spotify model, and
Yeah.
Spotify doesn't even use the Spotify model. They've evolved past that. And there's different spectrums of different scaling frameworks. And I
Yeah.
think when you're going to pick one knowing what the trade-offs are and what you're optimizing for based off of what you pick. I think oftentimes people do tend to lean a little heavy towards safe. And when I go in there and I look and I'm like, oh, well, you only have 40 people doing the work. Like, you really have one product. Like, we could put this into 5 teams over one product backlog. Like, you don't need 2 release trains for this. Like, you're just not that big. And so I think sometimes people make their problems harder than they need to be. But if that's where you need to go, then that could be a step in your agile journey. I don't think you're ever done. I think that you always need to continuously improve and try new things. But if I had to say, like, there's some rules of thumb, it's cross-functional teams that can solve problems, any problem that comes down a backlog, one person that decides the order of that, and then release very frequently and learn from that and have a way to measure that. And so if you're doing those things, I think you're going to find quickly, like, certain things work and certain things don't. If you add delays in your process, if you get further away from your customers, those are going to be things that slow you down. And they might seem like, oh, we're really efficient right now, but you're trading off some effectiveness and you're probably not delivering the value back to your organization. So I'd say always keep learning, always keep reading, listening to podcasts. Like, there's always so much out there to absorb, and just keep seeking to understand and find better ways.
Yeah, no, that's great. So that manifesto itself, right, says that, Agile is about uncovering better ways. So it's good to hear that Spotify actually adapted their model too. Like, do you have more intel on what that was? Like, how did they adapt the model?
There's not a lot of information out there. So Henrik Niebuhr had that video and some different articles out there, like almost a decade now, that kind of made this popular. And he's not there anymore, and where it is now is very different. So there's reports about that. There's different articles that they talk about. Spotify doesn't even do a Spotify model, right? So but what has happened is there's a lot of consulting organizations that kind of took this and said, oh, no one's really owning that, we can make it our model. And they've kind of said, here's a transformation you can go buy off the shelf at Costco, we can plug it into your organization. And whenever you do that, there's not going to be a lot of ownership, right? Like, what is getting sold, I feel like, in those types of transformations a lot of times is practices, not values and principles. And so, great, you do a PI planning. Great, you do you have a conference internally. Great, you do hackathons. But, like, if the principles aren't there of frequent delivery, consistently learning, getting close to your customers, aligning around your customers, transparency, entrepreneurship, inspecting and adapting, all these things, right? Like sharing information, that if you don't have those items in place, then you're not going to get the same results that the organizations that do have that type of culture, are getting.
Yeah, definitely. No, that's great. So let's talk about self-organization. So how do you teach or how do you share about self-organization if a development manager or somebody new to Agile comes to you and says, oh, like, how does self-organization actually work? So how would you do that?
The simple way to think about self-organization is you don't tell the how. So you set a vision, you set the why, and you set guardrails, boundaries of like where we're going, and then have some shared accountability. One of my favorite things to do when I start an engagement off is I really push for this with all organizations I start with is I like to do team self-selection. And so what that is usually we do training and we've got to give people some background, right? So they understand why they want to be cross-functional, what self-organization actually means. And then right after that training, we do team self-selection. So you say, here are the products. Let's just say we have 3 products and we need 3 teams under each of them. You can pick which team you want to be on. You can pick who you're going to work with. But here's my constraints. And usually I work with leadership to figure out the boundaries. And it's like, I need each team to be able to take something from concept to cash, right? Like I need them to be able to finish something. If they say, oh, we can't write an automated tests, or we don't have Azure experience, so we can't do anything in the cloud, that's not good enough. You need to get those skills in your team, and you need to, trade people around so that you have all the skills to do something. Maybe it's number of people, right? Like I'm only willing to invest enough to have 7 people on this team, and I want, I can only have 10 people on this product, organized into 2 teams. So like figure out how you want to organize. So you figure out what those constraints are with leadership, and then you facilitate usually multiple rounds and let people pick where they want to go. There's going to be conflicts. There are going to be things where they don't meet the guardrails. And then usually as a facilitator, you facilitate those conflicts. and
Yeah.
you say, hey, let's figure out how to resolve those. And by the end of the afternoon or the session, you come
Yeah.
across with a team where people have picked who they're going to work with and what product they're going to work on. And the buy-in just is tremendous once you're doing something like that. Because people, if we go back to Daniel Pink and his three
Mm-hmm.
things that really motivate people are purpose, autonomy, and mastery.
Mm-hmm.
You've hopefully let them align around some kind of purpose, the product that they believe in. You're
Mm-hmm.
giving them autonomy to pick who they work with, maybe when they
Right.
work, because some teams might
Mm-hmm.
work at different times.
Yeah.
And then all they got to do is figure out how to be masters at their craft, and they're going to have everything, set off to be, intrinsically motivated.
Yeah. No, that's great. That's great. Okay, let's start talking about, okay, how does all this relate to remote work? Suddenly we've all had to go remotely, and what are you seeing working with teams? What kind of challenges and what advice are you giving to teams, agile teams working remotely, things like that?
Yeah, I'll say that the teams that got the self-organization thing figured out are probably
Yeah.
doing really well.
Right.
The
Yeah.
teams that aren't probably really struggling right now.
Right.
Heard from some different organizations I've worked with that, if they would work the way they used to, where they were more micromanaging,
Mm-hmm.
to where we are now, where they're much more aligned around products and value and
Mm-hmm.
self-organization,
Mm-hmm.
there's no way they would be able to function and even operate in this new world. But what I tell teams is when you go to remote, like just
Mm-hmm.
simulate what you would do if you were in the real world. And
Right.
so what I mean by that is, let's just say you and I right now, we're on a Zoom call. If
Yep.
I were to shut my video off, that would be
Right.
that would be like us sitting in a meeting room and me putting a bag over my head and cutting
Yeah.
out the image. So I can see you, but you can't see me. That would be just
Right.
weird. Don't do that, right? Like it's
Yes.
it's kind of one of those things. Or like if you were on a Zoom call and you started sending personal messages back and forth while somebody else was talking, that kind of be
Mm-hmm.
like passing notes in the back of the classroom. Not
Right.
cool, right? Like we would call that out if that was in a professional environment. So don't do
Right.
those types of things.
Right.
So I always like think about what would it look like in person with what we're doing, and how can we
Mm-hmm.
best translate that?
Right.
So there's a lot of features that are out there in Zoom. I think Zoom's a great tool where you can make, like when I do my classes, I make everybody a co-host. And
Mm-hmm.
then we do a lot of breakout rooms, and that gives them the ability to move from a breakout room, so a small group of, let's just say, 4 people, and they say, oh, I have a
Ah.
question. I want to go talk to group two. They can go and say, move me to group two, and move themselves in group two and go talk to me. Just feel like I'm standing up at one table and going over and moving over to the other table.
Oh, nice. Yeah.
And you can do the same thing. They come talk to me the same way as
Right.
the instructor. So, like, however you can simulate what it would be like in person, do that. I would say that, other things I've learned is that the environment changes when you bring a canvas. So if
Mm-hmm.
you're doing a video like this, but if we all start doing exercises together and I put up a Google Jamboard or a mural
Mm-hmm.
or something like that, some kind of virtual whiteboard where people can add stickies, we can draw, we can type, we can do different things, and we can capture
Right.
ideas onto a canvas. It
Mm-hmm.
changes the whole dynamic of the meeting and the event that we're doing. So I'd highly recommend having something like that at your fingertips. And it might take a little bit of time before the meeting to, have that stuff kind of ready and prepared and think about how you're going to facilitate that.
Yeah. From a facilitation stance, so what are some tips that you will give to like new Scrum Masters? I'm pretty sure you have a lot of people who teach Scrum who want to become a Scrum Master. So what are some tips that you give them after they're done from your class
Sure.
to enhance that?
Yeah. So I'd say the first thing is don't solve a problem for the team. Your job isn't to
Mm,
give them a fish, it's to teach them how to fish, right? And so
mm,
your job is to ask questions,
mm-hmm.
to not solve the problem, and it's gonna be painful at times. I mean, it's gonna be painful.
Right.
Like there's times where I start working with new teams and I used to count to 8 when we were in person in my back of my head, and I'd wait for them to say something. And sometimes they wouldn't say anything after I get to 8. It'd just be this big, long, awkward silence. And I just wouldn't
Yeah.
say anything. I'd be like, like, how do you want to handle this? And no one would say anything. Now when we're virtual, sometimes it's 12 or 15. And it's like eventually people get like, I'm not going to do this for you. You're going to have to figure it out on your own. And
Yeah.
part of it isn't, I don't think it's people being resistant. I think that for the longest time, people have said, oh, you can choose and you can pick, but if you pick the wrong answer, I'll pick for you. And they're just like, oh, sick of it. So they're waiting
Right.
for the rug to get pulled out from underneath them. And they're like, I'm just not going to, engage with that. And so you have to really build that trust up that, you really get to figure out how you're going to work and you're going to be
Hmm.
accountable for delivery. And so, it's good for you to take some ownership in that. And what I like to do is then give them multiple options and be like, well, here's multiple ways you could solve this problem. Here's three or
Hmm.
four ways that I've seen teams solve this problem.
Right.
Or there's one of those you want to try, or does that give you an idea of something else you'd like to try? And then they might come up with and be like, well, how would you handle this? Or how would you handle that? And I'll give them different questions, things that I'm thinking about. Hopefully, I'm helping them think about problems the way I'm thinking about them, but I'm not solving the problem. So think about taking on different stances of a teacher, a mentor, a coach, a facilitator, a
Hmm.
problem solver, not a problem solver, but like a manager of the process of like how people of the environment people work in. Those are all stances to be thinking of, and don't fall into the scribe secretary type of a stance where you're doing things for people. You're being the person that enters stuff into Jira or TFS or whatever tool you're using.
Yeah.
The person that, does all the dirty work. That's not your job as a Scrum Master. So
Right.
I guess I would coach people to stay away from those types of things and
Right.
to really embrace what a true Scrum Master is, and that servant
Hmm.
leader. But that doesn't
Hmm.
mean it's a servant leadership is still leadership. It's not just somebody who gets walked over, right? So like
Right.
you need to lead through influence, not through
Right.
control. You need to reveal instead of tell. And so
Hmm.
revealing the system to people
Hmm.
is a really powerful skill set for Scrum Masters. What I mean by that is you don't have to tell them the answer, reveal it to them. Show them here's the problem. Maybe it's with data, maybe it's with stories, whatever it might be. But when you can reveal the systems, people can't unsee that. And then they have
Right.
that mindset shift and they're going to make all the right decisions, or at least the decisions in the same direction you would
Right.
once they understand that.
Yeah, no, I mean, I can definitely relate to that one. I come from consulting background, so that was one of my hardest thing is to not become the subject matter expert and really wait and take the coach's stance or use powerful questions or clean language. So yeah, I think that is a huge area for growth for a lot of new Scrum Master or Scrum Master who are trying to become better.
Yeah, I always kind of joke around and say the Scrum Master doesn't really do work and they don't get their hands dirty. Like they don't actually like do. They're like oil in the engine. They make everything run
Right.
smoother, but they don't
Yeah.
actually like they don't make the pistons move. They're not part of
Right.
that. They just help everything move better.
Yeah.
And so if you feel like you're doing a lot of the work as a Scrum Master, then you're probably stepping into one of those
Yeah.
misinterpreted stances of a Scrum Master.
Yeah. And Jeff, I'm pretty sure you mentor a few new Scrum Masters too. So like that is one thing I actually have people that I mentor, I have to talk to them. They come to me and say, Vivek, I don't feel like I'm doing a lot or contributing. And they come to me. So if somebody comes to you, like I give them some tips in terms of how they can add value. But like, what are your advice for people who go from like a different field to go become a Scrum Master and it's really different. You're like you said, you're not getting your hands dirty. So that kind of work is new. And there's also a little bit of imposter syndrome for the new
Hmm.
Scrum Master. So what's your advice for them?
Good question. I would say that everybody has imposter syndrome. So I talked about Bob Galen right beforehand. He just had an
Yeah.
article on LinkedIn about he has imposter syndrome, and here's a guy who's
Oh, wow.
has multiple books that he's authored. He's teaches agile leadership at executive levels across major companies,
Right.
and people look at him as the expert, right? But he still feels that. I think everybody feels that. So like it's okay. Like it's normal. I would say, have confidence, continue to learn, always be seeking to learn. Those would be the things, some of the things I would look to do as a Scrum Master to maybe get rid of that. I don't know, how do I actually, provide value, or am I good enough to do this, or do I have the right answers? But but the question of really how do you get away from the, I don't know if I'm providing value. I think you have to say I don't do my job isn't to produce stuff. It's to make sure that I'm promoting a culture where people can grow and to flourish and the team can flourish. So you're taking more of a stance like a gardener. Like you don't actually make the garden grow. You just create the
Nice.
environment for them to grow. And
Nice.
so that's what your job is. And so look, you're on the watch for conflict. You're trying to, mine for conflict and say, when something's
Yeah.
small, let's figure out what's going on there. You're helping
Right.
the team to figure out how to run the most effectively and teach them. Another good measure is like, hey, what happens when you're not there? Can the team function without them? Are you helping them to not be reliant on you? Are you kind of almost working yourself out of a job? If you're doing that, that's probably a great thing because when the
Right.
team itself can now operate more independently and is high functioning, that gives
Mm-hmm.
you the flexibility to work on higher level things. Now you can go and
Right.
work with the product owner, especially if it's across multiple teams. And now you can go work at the organization and say, hey, that HR practice where we promote individuals over teams? Like that totally negates what we're talking about from a Scrum standpoint because it's all about the team. And here we're saying it's all about the individual and heroes.
Right.
And those are in a conflict. How do we solve that? Right.
Mm.
And so, or, whatever the next biggest dependency that you have on your team. So there's an organization where it's like, oh, every year we rip these Scrum teams apart and we reform them on however we decide to do it because we change the whole funding of where things
Right.
are funded. So we get a high functioning team and then we break it apart and then we have to rebuild all that every single year. How do we stop that from happening? Those are big problems that aren't solved
Yeah.
overnight. And
Yeah.
as a Scrum Master, when your team's working on is highly functioning and can handle things
Yeah.
without you, then you can go work on those big problems.
Yeah. No, that's great advice. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for that. So Jeff, maybe this is the last or second last question. So we wanted to learn, like, you've been an agilist for a while, you run an agile company. So what are some things that you are focused on or you're trying to solve, or what's lying in your learning journey? What are you doing these days?
Yeah, so organizational agility is one of the things that I don't focus on agile transformations or just the agile journey. I think
Mm-hmm.
of Scrum and Kanban and extreme programming as tools to get us there.
Mm-hmm.
I like to dive more into what are the things inside the system that are
Mm-hmm.
stopping us from being more agile? How can we
Yeah.
share information more frequently? How can we apply the transparency throughout? So why create a policy, right,
Mm-hmm.
to manage expenses? Would transparency just fix that? What if we just made that stuff transparent and it would
Right.
self-regulate itself? Like,
Yeah.
how can we open up flexibility so people can make decisions and have free flow
Mm-hmm.
of information? Those are things that I'm really passionate about.
Yeah.
And they get outside of the Scrum team roles. They're more about like all the sub areas within the organization that support products being built.
Mm-hmm.
But they definitely create an environment and a culture, and I think those are the areas that I like to focus on right now. So I keep
Yeah.
working with teams on that, and every team's a little different, and there's a lot of patterns that have emerged, but I'd say it's even more complex than maybe some of the product development world we're walking through some of those obstacles.
Nice. Well, that was amazing. Thank you so much again, Jeff. I actually learned a lot, your stance on how you view things. So I really appreciate it. And I'm pretty sure the audience is going to love it. And I'm pretty sure we encourage people who are watching this video to throw some questions, and happy to answer some of that in the comment section. But thank you so much, Jeff, again. It was great having you in the podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It was a lot of fun.